Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have everyone here today in through our relatively new facility here for the University of Queensland, 308 Queen Street. Not a particularly flash name, but it's a great facility to have something in the city that we can bring people together to share ideas and hear from great speakers like Mark, and which is a great opportunity today. Just on behalf of the University of Queensland, for the Institute for Social Science Research, Centre for Policy Futures, and the School of Political Science and International Studies, and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, it's great to have everyone here today for a public discussion with Professor Mark Considine. My name is Tim Riddell. I'm a professor at the Institute, and along with my colleagues Greg Marston and Brian Head, we're very excited about this opportunity to host Mark today to share and explore the important issues and ideas in his new book, The Careless State, Reforming Australian Social Sciences. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodianship of the lands which we meet today, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. And we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So welcome everyone today, particularly welcome Mark, Professor of Political Science at the University of Melbourne. I'll do a bit of a fuller introduction for Mark a little bit later. Sue Cook, the Executive Director of Anglicare Southern Queensland, who will respond to Mark's comments throughout the day, industry representatives and UQ colleagues and distinguished guests. Just a bit of a quick introduction, housekeeping. Today's format's pretty simple. We'll shortly hear from Mark, who'll speak for around 30 minutes, reflecting on the themes and ideas in his book. Sue will then respond for around 10 minutes on the issues raised in Mark's presentation and beyond, and particularly drawing on her extensive experience as a community service leader. We'll then have around 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So please start thinking about questions you might want to raise with Mark and Sue as they present this evening. Then we'll conclude around 6:30. Go downstairs for invite everyone to join us for refreshments in the atrium downstairs around 6:30. So I think the idea around tonight's presentation actually started with Brian Head. I think he'd saw Mark present some of these issues prior to the book actually being released, and we had a discussion with Greg Marston. We thought it'd be a great opportunity to get someone of Mark's calibre and interests together here to have a public discussion around some of these really important issues in public policy. And as the book comprehensively details, the Australian social services system has been subjected to many so-called reforms by governments of all persuasions over many years. And as Mark's book outlines across the spectrum, employment services, vet, aged care, childcare, health services, disability, NDIS, and much more. And as Mark outlines, these reforms have had markets and choice as their central organising principles. And these reforms are very much contested and have many implications for our relationship with government and many organisations, such as Anglicare and many others that are represented here today, in terms of their delivery of services. And most importantly, implications for the people who need these services in an ongoing way. As Mark says, there is a long list of royal commissions and public inquiries which suggest failures persist in the quality of social services based on this reform agenda, or as he labels it, the choice revolution. And reading Mark's book, I think the central provocation that he talks about for real reform is how do we move from choice to voice, where citizens and communities have greater decision-making opportunities in policy making and service design. So without further ado, I'll introduce Mark. He's the Richmond Barry Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Melbourne. He and his team have pioneered both empirical and theoretical advances in our understanding of street-level governance and the mechanisms that define outcomes in multi-agent public services. In addition, Mark has worked in government and the not-for-profit sector and has had significant leadership roles, including most recently as provost at the University of Melbourne. So I welcome Mark.
Thanks very much, Tim. Now I have to remember to turn on my pocket. Hopefully that gives you enough volume. All good? Terrific. We don't have moving pictures, but we do have a couple of slides. First of all, let me also echo the acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, and hope that in addition to all the other things that we value about their contribution, that we're about to value their voice in a constitutional change. Great to be here. I was trying to reflect on how long it is since I've had a proper visit to Brisbane. It doesn't count changing planes at the airport, and it's been a while. So it's lovely to be invited back, and always good to be talking about work that you feel strongly about and which I hope is of value, that makes a contribution. Having a new book out is always a kind of precarious existence. Adorno once said when he published a book, it felt like he was standing on a cliff throwing a bottle with a message in it into the sea. In that old 18th century romantic sense, we don't throw bottles in the sea anymore, even if they have got interesting notes in them. But that kind of sense you always have, that when once you've sent it to the publisher for the last time, it's now actually all up to everybody else. And to have people want to read it, want to talk about it, want to disagree with it, want to take the ideas further is undoubtedly the greatest privilege I think we have as people writing books, and hopefully at the end of it all, things move. Because the point of the exercise and the point of the book is to say, it's not good where we are right now. And I don't want to start with the complete catalogue of horrors. You can read the book for that. But I wanted to highlight a few of the things that got me to write the book and do the research that sat behind it. The original starting point is a long time ago, 30 years ago, when the then Labor government in Canberra decided we didn't really like what the CES was doing, or we didn't think it was doing a good enough job, and we would change that and have a more contested way of delivering services to unemployed people. And initially that contested model involved the CES continuing to run its own special desk called Employment Services Australia for long-term unemployed people, and non-profits and some for-profits being given contracts to do the same. And separate to it all was a regulatory authority called ESRA, who would monitor that everything was done correctly and that it all went to plan. Paul Keating had been the driving force for this, and he argued that it was an idea that he and Simon Crean had come up with when they'd been looking at microeconomic reform in the utilities area, particularly in telecommunications. Just thought it'd make sense, just take that model and bring it over here and put it into action with particularly with long-term unemployed people. I got interested in that and was involved in the Deakin group that were training the first round of people who were doing this case management model, and then started to discover that this was happening in places elsewhere in the world. So the first significant project I did was to compare Australia's semi-private model with a semi-private model in the Netherlands, the UK, and a not private but very decentralised model in New Zealand. So it was a long journey from there, following the employment services story right up until about 4 years ago, when another penny dropped, or another decimal coin dropped. A master's student came to me with a draft of a paper she'd been working on, part of which described the experience of a woman called Marie, who was then in her 60s, who'd been interviewed at length by this student in relation to another project. And part of Marie's story was that she still hadn't gotten over the experience her mother had had 10 years previously in moving into aged care. And so affected by it was Marie that she reported to this master's student, who was quite upset about it, that her strategy, Marie's strategy, was to stockpile pills in her bathroom so that she always had enough medicine in case somebody said to her, you have to go into residential care. And then her plan was to take them all. And this alarming idea, she said, she had got from two of her friends who had come to the same conclusion. Now, this was before the reports of the Aged Care Royal Commission. I had relatively little exposure to the aged care system at that stage. But this student paper alerted me to the fact that my vision of the world was too confined by the employment services story, interesting though I think it was, and it was time to kind of look more broadly. So that's what I did. I decided that it would be good to have a look at a number of the services that had been, if not privatised, at least taken out of the traditional public service delivery model and put into different kinds of funding, different kinds of delivery. Now, an important footnote in all of them was that they were never only public service delivered models, as many people in this room would know. Since colonial times, the state has shared social service delivery responsibilities with non-profit agencies, particularly churches, benevolent societies and the like. But the ones I were looking for were the ones where that had now evolved or morphed towards more private delivery. And to what I describe in the book as a service market model. Now, there's nothing particularly revolutionary about introducing markets into public services. That had already been happening in engineering services. It had been long held as a principle for contracting out road building and a variety of other things. But the decision to move larger and larger parts of what we might call the social care and social support system into service markets had, as Tim hinted in the introduction, a very important driving motive. And it was this idea that if governments could engender more choice, both for themselves and for the clients of the service, then some rather miraculous things would happen. And amongst those miraculous things was the idea that it would be less bound by heavy bureaucratic regulation, that you would, quote unquote, free up the service delivery model to be more responsive. And its responsiveness would be empowered by the fact that the clients could take their business elsewhere. And over and again, you would hear this argument, often passionately put, often by public servants who never themselves worked in a market, but had found themselves very enamored by this concept, that the client would be the arbiter of the quality of the service, and their ability to exit the service would drive the attention span of willing or unwilling entrepreneurs to pay attention and to get the service right. So that was choice revolution number one. But choice revolution number two, implicit and sometimes explicit, was that the government would increase its choice options. It would no longer be hidebound to simply deliver the service through its own delivery mode or arm. It could now say, well, we like Brown and Company, or we're going to give it to Acme. We could choose every time we put the service out, we could make a different choice. And this would be tremendously empowering, particularly at a period of time in the 90s when governments were thinking that the fun thing to do in government was steering, not rowing, where this arbitrary distinction between decision-making and direction giving and delivery could somehow be taken apart. And a new set of tools could be used for the steering part And then the rowing part could be left to, well, almost anybody. But in this case, to willing entrepreneurs, many of them brand new to the service. In the employment services case, in the first round, we had people who'd been very big in the chicken meat business. They set up organisations. Some of them had been in HR. Some of them had been in retail. We had a couple of travel agents convert their business into employment services. Really didn't matter where you came from in this model. You could be good to go. Now, what happened in that process, which I talk about in the book, is that for all sorts of good reasons and some not so good ones, the government honestly argued that this was going to generate greater levels of responsiveness. There's a famous economist called Albert Hirschman who says there's really only three ways in which a failing system or a system where we're not happy with what's happening, you can respond to that, and that's exit, choice, or loyalty. Exit is the economic solution. I don't like this, I'll leave and go somewhere else. Exit, voice, and loyalty. Voice is the political part. That is, I'm going to complain. I'm going to take it to the manager. I'm going to get together with my colleagues and we're going to have a discussion about it. And loyalty is shut up and put up with it. And Hirschman shows through a number of studies that those different ways of responding have very powerful implications for what happens to the ongoing problems in a system and whether they're likely to be resolved. So service markets, as many in this room would know, and I don't need to labour this point, are completely unlike product markets. And the easiest way to summarise this for students who haven't worked in this field or people from the non-services area is to say, a service isn't already produced and warehoused waiting for you to choose it. A service only exists at the moment it's consumed. And that single fact changes everything about what a service needs to look like compared to a product, and what all the infrastructure that needs to sit behind needs to look like compared to a product. Governments, as I said, were quite good at getting private sector people to provide the products. There are ways of testing those, of regulating how they're produced, checking them, and then delivering them. To regulate the delivery of a service, on the other hand, is a significantly more difficult and complicated story. And in most of the services that I talk about in the book, very little heed was given to that fact. Optimistic, one might say simplistic assumptions were generally made about the fact that if the contract was clear on what we wanted, if the delivery wasn't there, the penalty would be paid, we'd exit you from the system and get somebody else to do the job as required. So a great deal of emphasis was placed on clear specification in a contract of what would be delivered. And most, if not all, of the delivery standards were around outputs. How many clients would be served, what services they would get, what time period that would occur, and that was measured back against the performance criteria in the contract. There were, and I know because I worked on this at one stage for the then government, I think it was, I'm going to say Rudd, but it might have been Gillard government. They installed a quality measure into the employment services contract, K3 it was called, KPI 3. We spent more than 6 months trying to get both the government and the industry to agree on what the measure of quality would look like. And even with the minister urging from the side, we didn't manage to land it. There was no agreement on what a measure of quality would look like that the industry was prepared to work with. And that was partly, I think, an indication that in addition to these different perspectives on the nature of a service versus a product, the importance of exit as the engine for choice, that something else had already taken place in employment services, and I discovered this in vet and all the other services I looked at. And that was that within a couple of years of the process of creating a service market, in addition to the, let's call it the delivery challenges that I'm going to come back to, the government had also set itself up with a massive political challenge. All of these now millionaire and sometimes billionaire providers were absolutely rusted onto the political process and onto the party system on both sides of the ledger. Ministers, husbands, wives, spouses, family members, etc. You could work your way down the list and find on both sides of the aisle direct links to companies that were delivering childcare, aged care, employment services, vet, you name it. Within months of leaving Parliament, ministers, particularly on the Liberal side, but there's some good Labor examples as well, landing themselves straight onto the boards of companies that they were previously responsible for regulating. And this political burden, if you like, meant that no clean conversation about the value or the ways to change this service could occur without quite a bit of risk for the ministers or shadow ministers who wanted to tackle it. We provided an outline for how particularly the service for long-term unemployed could be improved in the Australian model, and we're told by the minister's trustee assistant that the ideas were great, but that was not the level of risk he was prepared to work with. In other words, even bringing it to the table would expose him to too much pushback. So the market model began to move right across the story. And I think it's important to recognise that one of the things that had changed was that the way of engaging local non-government agencies and collaborators also had changed very significantly. If we take, for example, the childcare case, there had been private provision of childcare through non-profits for many, many years before the Hawke government began to fund a more market model. And in those cases, the model was generally a community board of some sort, a committee, co-op, sometimes supported at the municipal level by access to the facility, which was owned by the local council. Often there was a co-payment, so it wasn't completely outside the market, as it were, but it was favoured by the then governments on a sort of grant-by-grant basis, because that level of local governance was seen as a way of keeping the service responsive and honest. And frankly, it was a source of volunteer labour. Every time there was a working bee, every time there was a readathon or whatever, parents and grandparents and so on would pile in. In the process of turning childcare to a more openly competitive market, one of the interesting things is to see how that community style model began to get demonised. One of the things that was said about it was that it empowered a caste of professional childcare workers who had become, quote, rent seekers, seeking their own high wages and not seeking great efficiency for the service. This was based on zero evidence, I should tell you, but this became one of the critiques of the so-called community services model. Secondly, it was argued that often they would be quite happy to serve the families and children that they already had enrolled and weren't particularly interested in expanding out to new suburbs or places where other needs were developing. There was an element of truth in that. The social capital model often did depend on there being an existing network of people ready and willing and able to get together. And greenfield suburbs with nothing but houses and a few roads didn't prove an easy area for many of these organisations to populate. So bit by bit, the value of the model got chipped away. And part of that was also a feeling by decision makers that the community board idea created a level of interference between the signals they wanted to send to the service delivery and what kickback or pushback they might get from parents and community and so on. So the favoured model was to be more commercial and to move away from funding centres, worrying about their infrastructure or nominating what sort of staff they should employ, and instead to move to an individual voucher model. So individual users of the service would get a subsidy, and then it would be up to the centre, private, public, whatever it might be, to aggregate all of those financial elements into a budget. That left it to the entrepreneur to decide how to distribute the internal funds between staffing costs, other activities, capital if the premises had to be purchased or leased or rented, and costs to management and the shareholders. And we saw very quickly in the commercial childcare story the development not only of much cheaper labour costs, some might say extortionately cheap labour costs, but certainly a much lower base for the payment of salaries into that sector. But we also saw the fast development of a real estate component of commercial childcare, where much of the ultimate profit or gain in the system wasn't in the service itself, but in the developing real estate value of the properties that the companies would own, and which they would have discounted against the cost of running the business for most of the early years. What got lost along the way in cases like childcare was a degree of local responsiveness and local engagement. These became highly mobile providers in many cases, who would move where they thought the best margin would be, and then close and move again if they got better opportunities. I think an unintended consequence of that in the childcare case was that, and we're seeing it a bit now in aged services, was that very quickly local government decided to exit wherever it could. The signal from Canberra was we're going private, we're paying the unit cost, we're paying a subsidy to individual providers, and then the entrepreneur takes care of the facility, all of the backstory. Local governments in almost every case, certainly in Victoria where they'd been heavily involved, slowly but surely moved out and said, well, the market can now take care of this. That's the signal we're getting from Canberra. Just as we're now seeing with things like Meals on Wheels, that they've decided that, you know, if the name of the game is market, we'd rather play somewhere else. So the rent seekers argument became a common way of saying that there was greater efficiency to be had in the private delivery model, and the voucher type payment model for executing that was also a signal to say we're not investing in this as a government or as a community for the long term. We're investing in the service for the individuals, and the market needs to take care of that investment side and figure out where to borrow the money, where the real estate should be, and so on, with some interesting consequences, as we'll see maybe in the discussion afterwards. TAFE was going through the same contortions at about the same time, TAFE and VET. The federal government decided, first of all, that it needed a rapid expansion, and the best way to do that was to invite more private providers, initially in a model of so-called contestability, but eventually in a model which argued quite openly that the monopoly position that TAFE had in many states needed to be challenged. You can always tell in these debates when somebody says that the public service is a monopoly, what they really mean is we need to close it down as fast as we can. So the contested model in VET funding under John Dawkins lasted for 4 or 5 years, and then morphed into a model of funding which essentially signalled again that the government at Canberra level anyway was paying for individual vouchers for those who were using the service. It was no longer interested in funding the infrastructure or the entirety of the model. In the TAFE case, state governments in many cases decided they wouldn't buy that model, as they'd often done in the other privatisations or marketisations. They decided they would keep their TAFE going. In Victoria, the then Baillieu government decided it would keep it going, but it would take 300 million out in a big budget cut and replace almost all the CEOs and boards with people from the private sector so that it would look and feel like it was a privately run operation. But they didn't close it down. So TAFE sort of held its ground, unlike certainly what happened in a number of the other sectors. In order to get that voucher type model working in vet, they had to create a sort of confection called competencies to replace what had been a qualification-based model where teachers would set a curriculum in a particular area, and that curriculum would be somewhat standardised across sectors. The competencies argument could fill an entire lecture, so I won't dive deeply into that. Suffice to say, what it was doing was exactly what we would have predicted from this confident model of contracting upon which this new service market model had to depend. That was, you need to be able to specify in the contract what it is you're purchasing. You can't be purchasing a process, you have to be purchasing something that looks like a definable unit of value that you can somehow measure and pay for. And that seems not unrealistic until you ask yourself in an educational context, how the hell are we going to define all these competencies and create strict measures around each of them? Might be possible to say that in regard to higher level skills in welding. Not so easy to say in the case of certs for welfare or other activities. And nevertheless, that was the funding model and that was what was required. And that was the way in which the vet sector was required to operate. Like the other services going to market, throwing the doors open to new entrants meant a rush of new vet services across the country. I think in the first year, something like 900 new providers were registered. The numbers drifted down a bit after that, but a massive expansion. Some of them with no premises, just a website. Some of them a single service operation. Some of them, as somebody pointed out to me in Sydney a few weeks ago, started off and have maintained their status as what is described as ghost colleges, where there is actually no physical place for students. It's all done remotely. So these are the, I hesitate to say highlights, doesn't sound like high, does it? But these are the notable elements that I discovered were consistent across all of these services that had made the transition. The governance motive and the hopes of the political leadership, both Labor and Coalition, were remarkably similar. And the tools they chose to execute were also very similar. In fact, you can see them trading from one to the other. The star rating system that's now being used in aged care is sort of an adaptation of what they trialled and used for many years in employment services. So there are 3 cases in the book that show that services can be run differently. And it's not for me to say better, although you'll see when you read the book that some of these alternate 3 avoid the big mistakes of the service markets, which is overvaluing the choice issue, opening the door to massive amounts of fraud, and devaluing certain parts of the service delivery model. The 3 that I talk about in the book is NDIS, which I think you could honestly say is sort of teetering in the middle of the range. So some wonderful things about the way that model was designed, with real voice and say for participants, and some really interesting sort of middle range instruments like the use of local area coordination and support coordinators, but some disastrous other issues that relate to the overconfidence in market provision, the inability to see that you need to invest in aggregated services for groups of people and not turn them all off on their own to go struggle. What could we say that might show us a direction to improve the ones that are failing and bolster the ones that we know are working well? Well, the first thing to notice, and I'll be quick with this because my time is nearly up, The first is that in all of the cases I've described, the first thing that happened was that the delivering department started to lose operational knowledge. You could see this in employment services within months of the contracted out model. The managers you would meet were oblivious to the tactics and activities that either for better or for ill that their own delivery people were doing. And their response to that was to say, well, it's not our issue. It's what we call the black box model. We have our goals at the beginning in the contract and we have our measured outcomes. How the providers get there is their ingenuity. And of course we wouldn't know about that. Well, that's like not knowing how your own service is put together. And that's the first assumption that needs to change. And in those services where there is an open model of service delivery, even if it's contested, even if there are parts of it that we argue about, where there's transparency, we're in a much better place to talk about value for money, care for the community and so on. Secondly, we've got huge problems of fraud and gaming in these systems. At least 20% of the NDIS is being defrauded and probably another 15 or 20% is disappearing to misadventure. So that's not an acceptable basis for any service, and it'll just drive down public confidence, and that needs to be addressed. Happy to talk about that more in the Q&A if we have time. We have to rethink the role of the NGOs. This idea that a market provider who's just arrived from the chicken meat industry has exactly the same to offer as an organisation that's had over 100 years of commitment and involvement is a ridiculous fantasy that needs to be challenged. And governments need to be in the business of saying that they support and invest in those longer term relationships. Does make it tricky when you have a competitive tender. You have to be careful that you're being fair to people, but that also means you can't rely entirely on competitive tenders that measure only the input and the output and are blind to what happens in the middle. The third bit takes longer to think and talk about, but it's basically an argument to say the regulatory model that goes with this choice story is all wrong. It basically relies on only two big instruments in the hand of the government. One is to rain down regulations every time something happens. Another 20 or 30 or 40 pages of regulations. In employment services, the regulations, if you include those in the contract, exceeded 2,000 pages. And I defy anybody, even with a team of lawyers working for them, to be able to navigate that without tripping on one of them. And guess what? It didn't stop massive fraud, didn't stop people parking clients instead of servicing, didn't do any of the things it was meant to, except drive up costs for the good providers. So that's lever number one. It doesn't work. Lever number two is to say, well, let's fiddle with the funding arrangement. We started out on this basis, let's yank a bit harder on this bit of the budget or something else. That only makes the system unstable, means people can't invest in innovation, they can't see any kind of long-term for what they're doing. Again, drives down quality. You need a more horizontal model of regulation, and there are really good examples of that in other sectors. But my time is up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Certainly a lot of food for thought, and I think for discussion a bit later. Before we get to the Q&A, perhaps let's introduce Sue Cook, who will be our respondent to Mark's presentation. Sue is the Executive Director of Anglicare Southern Queensland, which she joined in 2010, and she's been Executive Director since 2021. Sue's got wide experience as a health professional, educator, operational manager, and community service leader, and very much the focus is on person-centred care delivery, strategic planning, and liaison with stakeholders at all level of government and the community sector, and an understanding of the relevant legislation and regulation. So all the elements that Mark has been taking through. Anglicare, of course, undertaking significant reforms in aged care, child safety, youth justice, and human services sector. She's a registered nurse and has postgraduate qualifications in education and business administration. She's also a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So, certain reflections on that experience working as a social service sector leader, where she's many of the very much first-hand knowledge of many of the challenges and conundrums that Mark has outlined. So I welcome Sue.
Should I get this right? That's right. Great. Thank you. It's okay if I sit? Thank you. So thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation to address you all tonight. And I'd just like to start by also just acknowledging the First Nations people, the land that we gather today, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging in the care of their land and the waterways which surround us, which is the beautiful Brisbane River and beyond. So thank you, and any colleagues that are here tonight. I was quite excited to, first of all, Leanne, my colleague, had bought the book. So it was great. I drifted down to her desk and I grabbed the book and said, I'll just take that home for a bit of a read and then be invited to attend tonight and to hear Mark having read his book. And I think there's a little thing on the front of the book from Frank Bongiorno, which says, a stimulating account which will leave many readers angry, but all of them better informed. And as I read it, there was a little bit of anger coming through, but also that I was better informed. But also I have a value of hope at Anglicare, and I was also, instilled with some hope, which was also good. And I think for me, as 30 years as a health professional, when I first started out, 30 plus years actually, when I first started out in nursing, I had a personality that was always driven to change and to make things better and to see a better world and to see better outcomes for patients. And I can remember a colleague way back then saying to me, well, you know what, so if you wait long enough, there'll be a reform that addresses the issues that you have. And now I have lived through many reforms and I continue to live through many reforms. And I think the slide at the beginning said something about where do we start? And I had honestly hoped that by the end of my career, it would be I'd be getting close to the end of when are we finishing? But we always seem to be, starting and always in this cycle of reform. Now I work for Anglicare and I have proudly for more than 12 years, and they have a 150-year history of community service delivery and service, to community. And it's really interesting because when I look at the history of Anglicare and the Anglican Church, I'm not Anglican, but I've certainly read up widely about their history. I can see that what they've done is kept also moving and surviving reform to reform to reform, because that's what you do. And you kind of just have to keep rolling with, each reform that comes your way. So Anglicare itself, in the context of community service provision, provides around 12,000 episodes of care per day. So we service about 30,000 aged care clients living at home. We have 8 aged care facilities, which is about 700 residents. We look after 1,200 young people in out-of-home care every night. We have hundreds of people accessing our counselling, alcohol and drug, homelessness services, etc. So we're right across the community service provision scope. We have 160 pieces of legislation or thereabouts that we need to be compliant with. We have 6 regulatory frameworks or accreditation frameworks, over 70 service agreements with departments at a national and Commonwealth and state level. So when we look at onerous bureaucracy and red tape and all of those things, we're certainly right in amongst it, and we've certainly got a voice around trying to change that, not for Anglicare, but for the clients and the community that try to access the services. And for us, it's always trying to keep them at the heart of that story and of that narrative with both government funders, ourselves as community service providers, is what does this really look like for anyone who's trying to access social services in this country and in this state? And it's not easy. It's not an easy path to tread. So Anglicare also was an employment service provider. And they exited that. It was shortly after I started my tenure. So back in about 2012, they exited for, you know, some of the reasons that Mark outlines. We exited the NDIS service provision in November last year, although we maintain NDIS service provider status because we still provide NDIS services to some of our residents living in our aged care facilities. They've aged in place and they've chosen to want to stay with us. So therefore, we maintain NDIS registration status. But that in itself was also an onerous process to get status and to remain as a registered provider. But we exited the NDIS. We were very hopeful of the market shifts at the time and still remain hopeful. We were hearing great stories from many of the NDIS participants, and that was particularly around them finally starting to live their best lives on the funding that they were receiving. So lots of great stories. For Anglicare, it was just became not our core focus. And really, you know, we appreciated the market had matured somewhat in some of the thin markets we were in. You know, they got extra providers in amongst them. So we really had to just analyse where our focus was and exit that particular market. However, we were already hearing some of the horror stories, but also some of the great stories. So we're still watching that space as well, you know, very carefully. Some of the things that have really resonated for me with Mark's book and also Mark's conversation and narrative just now, a couple of things that I really wanted to call out. The notion of choice and this notion of choice and how you have choice when you're accessing service delivery or services in this nation or in this state. And who's controlling the supply? You know, because that comes into choice as well. It's all very well to have choice, but if there's actually not supply in the market, then you immediately don't get a lot of choice. And if you have vulnerability overlaid around your self-agency to make choice, then again, you immediately can't be a consumer in that market because it's very hard for you to navigate with that vulnerability and really enable and have self-empowerment and choice. And for the clients that we support, there's quite a significant number who really find it difficult to navigate the service provision and to navigate, you know, just through any of the systems that we're involved in, aged care system, disability system, child safety system. It's very, very hard for them to navigate it. But the control of supply is very interesting because even though we are currently contracted, you know, around many of our service lines, we're contracted with various departments and funders to do that. Just to maintain the supply and that is being demanded by the community need is almost impossible to maintain it. So immediately you are not meeting the demands and therefore the choice of the clients or the community that we're trying to serve. So choice in itself, Mark talks about exit. You know, true choice is also the ability to exit a service and exit a system. Very, very hard to exit a community service system. And, you know, obviously from our aged care perspective, exit itself is also tied with fees. So if you exit, you know, you pay a fee to exit. And for many of the age that we currently work with, perhaps the next generation is going to be very different because that'll be my generation and we know about, you know, how to calculate some of these things. But for the current generation, they would much prefer to just be acquiescent, to just say, no, don't rock the boat, don't disrupt anything. You know, change is very difficult for an older client. So when you start to think about true choice, how much agency do I really have when it comes to choice and what fees are involved and how hard it was to get into care in the first place because of the navigation of the system, choice almost becomes irrelevant. There's almost limited, if not no choice. And so our clients really require that support to really have choice and voice. So I really wanted to talk about that because that really resonated with me in the book around the notion of choice. And with government gateways. You know, if you're controlling the supply as a government because you control the gateways into service delivery, then again, where is choice kind of coming from for that client or for that community consumer? And if I can just briefly talk as well about restricting service lists through pricing or just through the example I can give you is with aged care provision in the community. The marketisation of that back in 2014 through to 2016, and a lot of providers came into the market in the home care package space. And we really looked at trying to get innovative and trying to have a service offering that was very different to each other, trying to stand apart, trying to really help the client with their choice. You know, if they want their, you know, part of it was to take them out for a walk with their dog, we try to package that in. So really trying to enable elder clients to live their best lives through choice and through creative packaging of their home care packages and their budgets. Apparently that got too hard. And so, you know, as government policies want to do, it shifted back to a really prescriptive service list and a list of service offerings that really stifled the innovation out of the industry again and out of the sector. So we're just getting back on that, looking to advocate for that again as we face more reforms in the home and community care space. But, you know, with reform really needs to come back in this notion of, as an older person, you know, to maintain living in my own home, it's not about 12 prescribed services that'll keep me in my own home. It's about living my best life and how can I do that? So really bringing innovation back in to that process. And that probably leads me into the next thing, which really resonated with me, was around the tendering and procurement process itself. So the tendering for services from a state and a Commonwealth perspective. Our perspective as Anglicare, you know, obviously there's competitive markets. It's competitive if you marketise. And so you're in there, boots and all, around a unit price that you're trying to compete against, and trying to get the cost to serve, which is what we call our unit price, that cost to serve, and really ensure that what you're packaging into that cost to serve or that unit price that you're wanting the government to procure your service for, you have to factor into that these days the cost of compliance. So those regulatory frameworks we talked about. And as compliance continues to increase and regulatory frameworks and the cost of that increases, that goes into that unit price. And you're trying to explain that to your consumers, you know, why your unit price is where it's set. And with the cost of compliance is also the cost of providing a quality service. And I'll come to the quality standards as my final point. And also you want to factor in innovation. And it's very, very hard with unit pricing and the way services are currently procured to price innovation into your model. But how do we ever get innovative as a service provider if we're not able to continue to invest in innovation and research and doing things differently and looking to see how can we improve the practice that we deliver? And the final thing around pricing and the price we want to sell our service to the government for is the notion of evaluating outcomes. And, you know, if many of you are researchers in the room, you'd appreciate that, you know, we believe that we are entering into an agreement with the government for services that are about improving the lives of our consumers or improving the lives of the clients who are coming to us. But at the end of the day, we never really get asked about that. We never really get asked about the outcomes to consumers, whether their lives were improved, what was the measure around that. And for us to do that, that's our own investment. So, you know, to evaluate your outcomes and truly make sure that you're making a difference to the people that we're meant to be here to serve, then we've really got to factor in some cost of evaluation of services and outcomes. And that's difficult in a competitive market. And if you're really going up against some people who are really looking to just get into the market, they're not going to price those things in. So you're immediately competing against those that aren't pricing in quality, evaluation, innovation, those three things. So it becomes very difficult in a marketised state. I would like to finish with the standard system. And, Mark certainly addresses it well in his book. With the standard system, there's a saying that we have at Anglicare, which is the quality standards or the standards as set by the government are not a benchmark for quality. So we have to always be rising above that benchmark if we really want to be providing a quality service. So they provide a standard, they provide, a level that we need to get to. We need to be well above that. And, we're very much about quality standards. We're very much about valuing the system and valuing the client. And so we invest a lot into ensuring our services are quality. And now we have the star rating system in aged care that we're now looking at. And my question about choice for consumers who are in the aged care system who now have the star rating system that they're trying to also navigate and deal with is we know, and you've seen it in the media, that there are providers who are 1 star. There are providers who are 2 star. And then the majority are 3 star, and that's okay. And I ask every day, if I'm a resident or family member of a resident in a nursing home in Australia right now, and they're out there on a 1 star, where's my choice? And where's my voice in really shifting that and really shifting that for me as a resident in aged care? So I said to Mark when I first met him, I said, I was so pleased to pick your book up and read it and actually find that I didn't have too much of a contra view. I was actually a little bit worried I was going to read this book and, we'd be up here having a really big, robust debate, and that wasn't going to happen. I left the book on my coffee table at home, and my husband picked it up, and I told Mark this story. I didn't get it back for 3 days. And that is because my husband is a registered nurse in aged care. And he's also been a vet teacher in the vet system. And he said to me, when you meet this Mark, can you tell him he absolutely nailed it? And I said, I will tell him. And that is because, with the mandatory registered nursing ratios and all of those sorts of things, and my husband who's an aged care nurse, we're really welcoming some of the aged care reform for that reason. We are a nurse-led organisation for our aged care services. So we're really welcoming that. But his story is that sometimes he struggles to actually get employment in aged care because he's overqualified and too expensive. Now, if that is the value that we're going to put on our aged and our elders as a society and as a community, then, we have a long way to go to shift the dial on this. But I was so glad that I could come up and share my reflections on the system. And but there is absolutely hope. Thank you.
That's right. Mark, we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions. So I'm keen for people, if they've had time, just reflect on some of the issues and maybe make a short question and a statement or a comment to Mark. It's obviously a lot of synergy in terms of Mark's presentation, Sue's reflections about the system and systems, how they operate and don't operate for clients.
So I'll keep it quick. I'm really curious. You talked about legislation and its impacts on the end, as I've known it in tech, the end user. But I'm a details person. I would love a great example of something really specific, like, this legislation, and then how that fell through to the end user, the customer, the person that is, receiving a service.
Yeah. I think the most recent one for us is we've been, as have the university, been looking at the Modern Slavery Act. And if you think about the Modern Slavery Act, that's about procurement. and about how we procure services and goods and supplies. And so we've had to do our own self-assessment around modern slavery and to be thinking about, is anything in our service lines somehow as a result of either child labour or, what they call modern slavery in, other countries and offshore, even onshore, but offshore, etc. So we've had to do this whole self-assessment, which is, fair call because very much around human rights, but really doing that assessment all the way down to the products that we're procuring on behalf of clients and consumers as well. So just following that and doing that self-assessment. That's one relatively new piece of legislation that we're looking at. But then the top ones are always things like your major acts like the Aged Care Act, which has been reformed. We've got 3 new response acts to the Commission findings. Workplace Health and Safety Act. We've got the Child Safety Act. We've got Crimes Act. So there's so many different acts that impact us, and we have to understand what we need to do to comply with them and fulfill our obligations and responsibilities as a provider. And we're not in breach of them. That's the main thing, that you're not breaching acts, not breaching law.
But you would
Look, the only comment I would make, just trying to bounce off your remark about being in the tech sector, did you say?
I've got a complicated background.
Okay. Well, one of the really big gaps in a service delivery model where you start with this kind of black box idea, that is, you start with the idea that the service provider has, as is often said, all their own special herbs and spices, and that's up to them. And then you use the legislation and the regulatory system to sort of try and box it in, to try and stop excessive behaviour. And on a good day, excessive fraud and profits. But you're always working from outside the box. And a simple example of that in the employment services case, 3 contracts ago now, was that they looked at the data for people exiting the system to get jobs, and they realised that the system was going pretty well. It was close to expectation, but it was taking longer from the time of registration with the service provider to landing into a job for those who were getting jobs. And they thought a good way to fix that would be to add a new regulatory requirement called speed to placement. All right, so in addition to meeting your target, we now also want you to meet a speed measure. Doesn't sound unreasonable if you believe there was kind of slack in the system and this would speed it up. What the providers quickly realised they could do would be to preference people coming in the door who were likely to be speedy and rank them both according to likelihood of employment, but also speed into employment. And then to downrank slower moving clients. That would produce a high result on the measure. It's invisible to government because they don't see the clients. The clients are inside the black box. And you could tell this story in every one of these services. You could tell it in vet, you could tell it in aged care, you could tell it in childcare and so on. If you decide you're willingly blind to the internal workings of the box, then you're always stuck. Adding regulatory burden that might solve part of the problem. Things did speed up. They were happy with the measure, right? You know, it's thumbs up all around in Canberra. But when you went to the agencies, you realised, yes, and what you've done is make life really hard for those who were already badly off. And the agencies knew that. Yeah. But you play that game or you lose your contract the next time.
Karen.
I'm interested, is Australia worse than other countries?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, can you maybe, I have that sense, I'm going to, but yeah.
So, as always, the worst is always in America, okay? If you want to get the worst, I didn't bring it with me because it's too horrendous. There was a case in the LA Times a few months ago where in one of the states, judges had conspired with private adoption agencies to divert children, homeless children, to a for-profit scam, basically selling them to people. They went to jail, but years after, hundreds of kids had basically been bought and sold, but by officials working in collaboration with cousins in the industry. So the worst things always happen in the US, but even there, we haven't seen the particular kind of black box model that Australia is now famous for. There's been market delivery models in the UK, in the Netherlands, and in Scandinavia, which we've looked at, where they've tried to involve private providers. And the short answer is the ones that work way better than ours are where the government has skin in the game and works in partnership and doesn't take itself off the field of battle and try and run this, from up in the corporate box. Every time Australia has done that, it's led to tears. There are plenty of examples, and we've said this to governments, and I'm sure colleagues here have been saying the same thing for years. It's not a rant against private involvement. It's a rant against this, the evidence on this particular Australian obsession with allowing a kind of black box model, and then the consequences that follow.
Thank you.
Countries have done well, and what have they done to be so good? A lot of countries have done well.
Right. So the best in the areas that I know well, and I'll let Sue answer for things that she knows way better than I do, but in employment services and training, and a little bit that I know of what we might call work with complex clients, the really innovative models that I've seen recently are in the Netherlands and the Flemish part of Belgium, and in Denmark. And even when you factor Denmark for having spent more money, even when you factor that down and say, well, if they hadn't spent that much money, the service model is still better.
So you want to add?
Yeah, from a healthcare social service perspective, Norway, also the Danes and the Germans when it comes to things like assistive technology, etc.
Scandinavians.
Another question?
Thank you so much for talking today. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've heard media reports recently about, for example, aged care providers can't provide food because they're not getting enough funding for food, or that childcare providers can't pay staff because there isn't enough funding that they're receiving. There's a big black box. So how does the additional funding component fit into a broken system?
Yeah, I don't think you can fix a broken model by pouring more money into it. Half of that money will just go into the bottom line of profit-taking companies. Some of it, the way it's being legislated, will go into the pockets of poorly paid workers. That's a big thumbs up. But if they're not empowered to run the service well, they're a better paid agent like in the childcare case, in a model where the service delivery itself hasn't improved.
So that's an interesting, I guess, point for you, is no additional money for you then on this feedback.
Yeah, well, we absolutely out there advocating and support increased wages for aged care workers. Those across the sector are advocating for that. The issue is where the money is going to come from, because we're talking about a significant uplift in aged care to do that. Who's going to pay? It always becomes the issue. So we know aged care workers need more money. We know we've got to value aged care because we don't value aged care. It's like I think Mark in his book talks about aged care services, but they're not healthcare models per se, and that they don't have doctors there. So therefore you're relying on your registered nurses there to be making key decisions about healthcare of residents. So you don't value that, you've got to pay for that. But who's going to pay for it? So the wages increase that we're hearing about, the government is saying they're just trying to find the money, right? So they'll find the money. 10% will come this year, 5% will come the following year. But what we're now hearing is that when they pay the money, that employers may not pass it all the way through, which is exactly what Mark is saying. And they may not pass it through even Anglicare, we're looking at it going, where you pay above the award, which is what we're trying to uplift. So you've got to do your modelling as to where's that money going to go to. What we find is if we don't pass it through this time, well, the staff are going to come back to us and seek to renegotiate higher wages anyway at the next DBA. So, it probably makes sense to pass it through and to do that. So it really comes down to who's going to pay. And there's lots of different models being tossed around in aged care at the moment, going back to the user pay model. To the clients or the residents or those in Australia that can afford to pay for aged care should pay for aged care or pay more for aged care. Get rid of caps, get rid of ceilings because there's caps to it every year. Get rid of all of that and go a bit closer to that user pay models.
Other question there?
It would be pretty apparent that the market model has been an abject failure in South West Queensland, as I'm sure it has literally in every other remote regional state. Mark, I haven't read your book. Obviously, I'll be buying it now because it's been interesting to listen to.
My publisher says thank you.
I mean, I think that really much of this discussion is actually about metropolitan failure. Because in some ways there is some choice. It may be very limited choice. There is no choice further west than Roma for any of what we're talking about. So I'm curious, where do we go with that?
Yeah. So let me just sort of follow on from the comments Sue made about the choice issue, because it is one we have to sort of really dig in hard and be careful that we don't throw babies out with bathwater. Obviously, it's a very appealing idea. And when worst comes to worst, you do need to be able to get out, right? Nobody's advocating, institutionalizing people and locking the door, right? But the really interesting study that I quote in the book, where a representative sample of Americans were asked if they had a terrible disease like cancer, would they like to choose the services? And a very high proportion, well over 60%, said absolutely. They then asked people who had cancer, and it was less than 12%. What the people who experienced that situation wanted was to be involved, to be listened to be consulted, to be part of the process. They didn't want to be put out in the market to say, well, you could try a bit of radiology if you like, or over there behind that door some chemotherapy, or maybe a little bit of herbs and spices, up to you. That they wanted to be embedded in a service that gave them agency. And paradoxically, the choice model often takes that away. It says, you chose us, you're here, baby. You do what we say. And unlike some of the services in these other countries, there is no voice, there's no authorised voice behind that closed door. And that's the same in all of these services. So it's not that we don't think people should have agency. And in the country is a good example of this. If you run a service in a country, I grew up in a country town, if you run a service in a country town and it slips by even 5%, the whole town knows about it. Right? Everybody works there, everybody's got an auntie there or an uncle there or something. So there are ways in which, even if there's only one or two providers, that they can be accountable to that community. But it is a problem in the so-called thin markets model. If you put your eggs in the basket of saying the consumer moving around is what will drive quality, all these, hyperactive agents, saying, no, I didn't like that one, I'll move somewhere else. That's going to make the entrepreneurs really pay attention. That is so far beyond being just a myth. It is a terrible lie to tell in a social services model, either in the country or the city, where if it says a childcare place in your suburb, you probably waited for, 2 or 3 months to get it. There's no way you're going to say the sandwiches were stale, I'm going to choose somewhere else. You'll have to wait another 6 or 8 months if you're lucky. So we've got to get off the choice bandwagon. Yes, you should be able to exit. Yes, there should be consumer defence, but we've got to get into the story about how our clients and their families are actually, and communities in the case of things like aged care and childcare, are actually included in the story.
But just one more question.
Onto that, a lot of people are saying that the solution to careless and low quality care is your payment by outcome impact investing models in terms of shifting the focus from outputs to outcomes. Do you feel that that's actually a solution? Though?
No.
Same problem.
No, that's the same problem. That's the same problem. That's just picking winners by another method. So, you know, I'm going to do what I sort of hinted at the early stage you should never do, which is compare a service delivery model to a product building model. But if you go and talk to the high tech firms in any country that has a high tech industry, and ask them how they work with their contractors, what they'll tell you is that they absorb them into their system of work. There's no go off to some far-flung place and come back when you've produced all the stuff we want. Our engineers will be on the shop floor with your engineers. We will problem solve together. We will work together, and we will make sure that what gets delivered is what we've said we wanted, or we'll agree on changing the specifications as we go along if the specs were wrong. And I think we've got to get back to a model of service that has that hard-edged, you know, relational contracting, where the government gets off its stool up in the clouds and says, well, we're in the service delivery business. We're not just in the funding business. We actually care about what happens inside the service.
So you want to have a closing comment?
No, I was just thinking about that notion of outcomes, because I think our journey is that, you know, we have short-term to long-term contracts, and there seems to be significant interest by funders on ensuring we've spent the funds and acquitting the funds, and sometimes it's just an output procurement model. And even then, sometimes that performance, you know, it's not part of the dialogue. But very much with the outcome focused model, we often say, don't you want to know what we did? Don't you know what we achieved? Want to know what we achieved? Don't you want to know what success looked like for the end search users or the consumers? And often it's not really. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark and Sue. It's been tremendous.
Thank you.
And I think that last point about relational, how we move to a more relational way of working across systems has really been at the core of what we've talked about as the reform going forward. So thank you both again. We've got some time now to pop downstairs for some refreshments and continue our conversation. I'd like to thank everyone today, particularly Mark and Sue. Also like to thank the faculty, Sophie at the back here, who's helped organise everything. Thanks, Sophie, so much for all your organising for this, and Brian and Mark as we've worked this event through. So thanks, everyone.